This was not a hotel. It was a ritual container, built in the shape of a maze and dressed up as a place you could check into. The interesting question is not whether the Overlook is haunted. The interesting question is why its own floor plan refuses to exist. Take out a pen if you have one nearby, because we're going to draw this hotel together, and it will not close. A window that opens onto a mountain view the building's own hallways make impossible. A corridor that a man walks down once and then walks down again and arrives somewhere that was not there the first time. A door with a number on it that the filmmakers changed on purpose for reasons nobody at the studio ever fully explained on the record. Put those three details side by side, and you stop looking at a haunted house. You start looking at a diagram. Welcome back to Esoteric Guardian. Before we go further, one thing needs to be said plainly, the way we say it at the start of every descent into a text like this one. Everything in this analysis is derived from mythologies, folklore, and esoteric interpretation layered onto a work of cinema, not from established science, and not from any claim that the events depicted are historical fact. We are not making metaphysical claims, and we are not asking you to believe any of it literally. What we are asking is that you look carefully at what was actually built and what was actually filmed, and consider what kind of intention it takes to construct a building this deliberately wrong. Because here's the part that almost nobody seems to want to discuss honestly. Stanley Kubrick did not stumble into an unsettling hotel by accident while adapting Stephen King's 1977 novel for his 1980 film. He built one, room by room, with a production designer, with blueprints, with a crew that measured walls and hung windows, and placed furniture with an obsessiveness the industry still talks about. And somewhere in that process, either by design or by an instinct he never explained in interviews, the hotel stopped following the rules that hotels are supposed to follow. Hallways that should connect do not. An office with a window behind the desk that, according to the hotel's own geography, should be looking into a solid wall. A lounge whose exterior establishing shot promises a view that the interior set cannot possibly deliver. Start with the window. In the Colorado Lounge, the ornate common room where the hotel's caretaker will spend the winter descending into something the film never quite names, there is a wall of glass behind the reception-adjacent seating. Sunlight pours through it in the establishing scenes. It looks like an ordinary, expensive, slightly gaudy mountain lodge amenity. Except that when you lay the hotel's implied floor plan on top of itself, corridor against corridor, exterior against interior, that window has no business existing. It faces a direction the building's own layout does not permit. There is no exterior wall there. There is, by the hotel's internal logic, another interior space entirely. This needs to sit for a moment. A single continuity error in a film this meticulously produced would be forgivable, even expected. Films are illusions stitched together from 100 separate rooms on 100 separate sound stages, and audiences forgive geography errors constantly, because audiences are not usually drawing blueprints in the dark. But the Overlook does not make one mistake. It makes dozens, and it makes them with a consistency that starts to look less like error and more like design. That is the reframe. That is the thing we are going to spend the next several hours taking apart, piece by piece, in obsessive detail, not as a ghost story, but as an architectural argument. Somebody built a building that could not be lived in, and then somebody put a family inside it anyway. There is a story from the production itself that circles back to this same unease, and it comes from someone whose job had nothing to do with symbolism or ritual geometry at all. A production assistant working on the film in England, tasked with checking set dressing after the crew had gone home for the night, later described walking the Colorado Lounge alone with a torch long after the lights had been cut. The set stood on a soundstage outside London, built full scale with the false window and the painted mountain backdrop visible beyond the glass. By day, under the crew's lighting rigs, it read as opulent, warm wood, patterned carpet, that towering window flooding gold across the floor. By night, alone, checking that nothing had been left switched on, the assistant found the geometry itself had started to feel wrong in a way that was hard to name. The window faced a backdrop that, walked around from the outside, revealed itself to be flat. A few feet of painted canvas and scaffolding behind a wall meant to suggest miles of Colorado sky. Standing in the dark lounge, knowing the view was fraudulent, produced a specific, small, physical unease. The sensation of a room lying to you about where it is. That is not a supernatural claim. Nobody is suggesting the set was possessed. But it is worth naming, because it points at something real about how impossible architecture works on a nervous system. You do not need a ghost to feel watched by a building. You only need a room that promises one geography and delivers another. The body notices before the mind can explain why. Here is the shape of what we are going to do across this analysis, and we are going to do it slowly, because the Overlook rewards slowness the way a locked room rewards patience. First, we will walk the history, the real lodge used for the exteriors, the deliberately non-functional interior built from scratch, and the first anomaly that broke the illusion for anyone who bothered to check. Then we move into the hallway layer, the corridors that do not connect to themselves, and the door marked 237, a number the novel did not originally use, changed for the film for reasons that were never made fully public. A change we are going to treat not as a footnote, but as a ritual seal. From there, the mirror layer, the gold room, the bathroom mirror that reverses a warning written on a door so that the message can only be read backward, a device that, read through the lens of threshold folklore, starts to look less like a jump scare mechanic and more like an old rule about how boundaries are supposed to be marked. Then the money shot of this entire investigation. The moment the film stops being about a man losing his mind and reveals itself instead to be about a structure that does not particularly care which man it uses. Jack was never the point. Jack was available. And underneath all of it, the same idea returned to again and again. This was never a hotel that got haunted. It was a container, built to hold something, engineered so that its own geometry would not let anyone leave cleanly. Through the shifting hallways, through the mirrored gold room, through a door marked 237 that may not be a room number at all, so much as a lock. The interesting question is not whether the Overlook is haunted. The interesting question is why, across every frame Kubrick shot inside it, the building keeps refusing to add up. And why, once you notice that refusal, you cannot stop seeing it. Somewhere in this story is a caretaker who came before, and what happened to him did not begin with madness. It began with the building deciding he would do. Now open the files. Stephen King wrote the novel that started all of this in 1977, and the book he wrote is, in almost every structural sense, a different story than the one Kubrick eventually put on screen. King's Overlook is haunted the way old houses in old novels are haunted. It has a history, a documented string of deaths, a boiler that needs tending, a hedge maze of animals that come alive at night. It is a malevolent building, but it is a comprehensible one. It wants something. It explains itself gradually,
through the interior monologue of a father sliding into addiction and rage. By the end of King's novel, you understand the hotel. You could, in principle, draw its floor plan and have that floor plan make sense. Kubrick took the premise and discarded almost everything else.
Gone is most of the hotel's explicit backstory. Gone is the sentient topiary. Gone, largely, is the interior explanation. What Kubrick kept was the shape. Family, isolation, hotel, winter. And what he built in its place was something closer to a diagram than a story. King, famously, was displeased with the result for decades. He has said in interviews that Kubrick's film feels cold to him, emotionally distant, more interested in dread as an atmosphere than in character as a through line. That criticism is fair as far as it goes, but it is also, we would argue, the entire point. Because what Kubrick built was not really trying to frighten you with a monster. He was trying to frighten you with a floor plan. Here is where the history gets specific, and specificity matters, because this is the part almost nobody checks. The exterior shots of the Overlook Hotel, the sweeping aerial approach through the mountains, the hedge maze from above, the establishing image that tells your brain, this is the building we are about to enter. Those were filmed at Timberline Lodge, a real working lodge on the slopes of Mount Hood in Oregon, built in the 1930s as a Depression-era public works project. Timberline Lodge is a genuine architectural landmark, hand-built by craftsmen using local timber and stone, and it still operates as a hotel today. If you have ever seen behind-the-scenes photography of the production, you have seen that lodge, its steep alpine roofline, its stone chimney, sitting exactly where it has always sat. But here is the detail that changes everything, and it is not a rumor. It is a matter of public record that Timberline Lodge itself now happily advertises. The interior of the Overlook was not filmed inside that lodge. It could not have been. What you see once the camera moves past the front doors, the lobby, the Colorado Lounge, the corridors, the Gold Room, the caretaker's apartment, the infamous bathroom of room 237, all of it was built from scratch on sound stages at Emi Elstree Studios outside London, under Kubrick's direct supervision, with a production design team led by Roy Walker. Sit with that for a second, because it is the hinge the entire mystery turns on. The building you watch from the outside and the building you walk through on the inside are not the same building. They were never meant to be. Nobody who built either set was under any obligation to make the interior geography match a real physical structure a continent away, because the interior was never supposed to correspond to anything except itself. And it doesn't, not even to itself. This is where we come back to the window, the one we opened with, the one in the Colorado Lounge, the wide, ornate wall of glass behind the lounge seating where light pours in during the film's daytime scenes. Roy Walker's team built that window as part of an enormous, genuinely stunning set, reportedly one of the largest interior sets constructed in Britain up to that point, full scale with real wood paneling and a working scale that dwarfs almost anything else built for a horror film of that era. The craftsmanship is not in question. The set is, by any measure, a triumph of production design. But when film researchers and obsessive fans, this has been documented and redocumented for decades now, most visibly by the analysis embedded in Rodney Asher's documentary Room 237, which spent an entire film cataloging the hotel's impossibilities, laid the Overlook's implied floor plan on top of itself, tracing hallway against hallway, room against room. That window turned out to be facing a direction the hotel's own established geography does not permit. According to the layout implied by the corridors we walk through to reach it,
That wall should back onto another interior space. Not sky, not mountains. Wall. This is the part that separates an accident from an architecture. A single geographic inconsistency on a production this large, filmed in pieces over months, is barely worth mentioning. Every film has them. Audiences forgive them constantly because nobody watches a movie holding blueprints.
But researchers who have gone frame by frame through the Overlook find this pattern again and again. The manager's office window that opens onto a wall the building's own layout says should not exist. Corridors whose turns do not reconcile with the establishing model shot used at the film's opening. Exit signs and fire doors that lead, according to the implied plan, into solid rock. Roy Walker has spoken publicly about the production, and by most accounts, the anomalies were not accidents born of sloppiness. Elstrie's stages were expensive, tightly scheduled, and Kubrick was, by every account from people who worked with him, a director who checked everything, twice, personally, down to the placement of a lamp. This was not a production known for continuity errors. It was a production known for the opposite. For a director who reshot scenes dozens of times over details other filmmakers would never have noticed. Which leaves us with a genuinely uncomfortable question, and it is the question we are going to keep circling for the rest of this analysis. If Kubrick was that obsessive about detail, and the hotel still does not add up, is that a mistake he simply let slide because it wouldn't read on camera? Or is a hotel that refuses to resolve into a coherent floor plan dressed up convincingly enough that the audience's eye glides past the seams actually the entire design? There is a second location tied to this production that almost nobody outside serious film circles knows about. A stretch of corridor built as a standalone set, disconnected from the rest of the hotel entirely, used for exactly one purpose. We are going to walk that corridor next, because it is where the geometry stops being an accident of continuity and starts looking, very deliberately, like a message. But before we go there, Timberline Lodge has one more detail about its own history that the hotel's later marketing has tried, gently, to walk back. And it involves a room number that was never supposed to exist in the real building at all. That's next. But dalsze, samé stranné. Let's recap what we've established, because the shape of it matters before we go further. The exteriors were filmed at a real working lodge in Oregon. Every interior, the lounge, the corridors, the office, the bathroom behind that door, was built from nothing on sound stages outside London to a design that never had to match anything except itself. And when researchers laid that interior geography over itself, the Colorado lounge window turned out to be facing a wall that, by the hotel's own implied floor plan, should not be glass at all. It should be solid. But no one can fully explain why a director as obsessive as Kubrick let that stand. And once you start looking for the reason, you find something much larger than one window. You remember the production assistant from earlier, walking the empty Colorado lounge set at night, finding the false window's borrowed geography unsettling once the crew had gone home, and the illusion had nothing left propping it up. That same unease, it turns out, was not confined to one room or one night. It runs through the corridors, too. And this is where the pattern stops being isolated and starts being systemic. Here is the exposition, and it is worth being precise about it, because precision is what makes the pattern undeniable. The hotel's corridors were shot across multiple separate builds, some hallway segments constructed as standalone sets, used for specific scenes, then struck or reconfigured for others. Film researchers cataloging the production, most exhaustively in the frame-by-frame work compiled for Rodney Asher's documentary, have matched shot to shot and found that a corridor established running one direction, past specific doors, in one scene, does not match the same corridor's implied route in a later scene. Danny's tricycle rides, the film's recurring long tracking shots gliding behind him at floor level as he pedals through the hotel's empty halls, are the clearest evidence of this. Trace his route on paper. It should form a closed, sensible loop through a real building. It does not. He turns corners that lead him past windows that, per the hotel's own layout, cannot be there, into stretches of carpet that do not correspond to any consistent floor. What this means, stripped of the film history trivia, is that the Overlook was never built to be navigable. It was built to be filmed. And those are not the same thing. A real hotel has to make sense from every angle, because people have to live in it, evacuate it, find their room at midnight without a map. This hotel only had to make sense from the camera's position in the moment it was being shot. Everywhere the camera was not looking, the geometry was free to contradict itself. That is the interpretation. Here is the darker read sitting underneath it. A building that only needs to make sense from one specific vantage point at one specific moment is not a building at all in the ordinary sense. It is closer to a diagram meant to be read by something standing outside of it, watching the whole shape at once, the way you'd read a sigil or a seal rather than the way you'd read a floor plan. The characters walking those halls experience only their own narrow, moving slice of the geometry. They never get to see it does not close. Only we do, watching from outside, frame by frame, decades later. Now, the number. In Stephen King's original novel, the room at the center of this entire mythology, the one containing the hotel's most infamous occupant, the one the story keeps circling back to, was numbered differently than it is in the film. Kubrick changed it for the screen, and the reason has been debated for decades without ever being definitively settled on the record. One frequently repeated account, tied to Timberline Lodge itself, holds that the lodge asked for the change because a room bearing the novel's original number actually existed in the real building, and management did not want guests avoiding it. Whether that account is the full story or a convenient piece of studio folklore, the effect is the same either way. Kubrick had a free choice of number for a door that exists nowhere except a soundstage, and he chose 237. Treat that choice the way you'd treat a locksmith's choice of a specific combination. Not arbitrary, not decorative, but functional. Numerology across multiple esoteric traditions treats compound numbers as reducible, folded down through addition into a single root value that is said to carry the number's true character. 2, 3, and 7 added together reduced to a number long associated across several esoteric and occult frameworks with completion, closure, and the sealing of a boundary. The number of a door that shuts behind you rather than one that stays open. We are not asserting this as established fact. We are noting that a director who checked every lamp placement twice did not pick this number by accident, and that the number he picked, read through that lens, functions less like an address and more like a seal stamped over a threshold. A single door, sealed. A hallway system that will not resolve into a coherent map. A window facing a wall that should not be glass. Individually, these read as continuity slips. Together they start to read like the architecture of something built specifically to not let its contents leave. Now for the part of this story that is not really about camera angles or set design at all. Because the Overlook, in Kubrick's telling, did not invent its own darkness with the family we watch on screen. The film tells us, explicitly, through the hotel's own manager, that there was a caretaker before,
a man named Grady, who took the same job, wintered in the same rooms, and, according to the story the hotel itself repeats to its next occupant, ended his family's lives with an axe before turning it on himself, inside these same walls, during an earlier winter of isolation. Picture what that means, stripped of the ghost story trappings for one moment. A man takes a seasonal caretaking job to support his family through a hard winter. The isolation stretches on, week after week, snow sealing the roads, no way out until spring.
Something in him breaks, quietly, in rooms nobody else was watching. And by the time anyone from outside the property could reach the hotel again, everyone inside had already been lost. Whatever supernatural framing the film hangs around that story, the emotional core underneath it is achingly ordinary. Isolation, pressure, and a family that had nowhere left to run once the roads closed behind them. The film treats this not as backstory, but as pattern. The hotel's manager tells the story almost casually during a job interview, as due diligence rather than warning. And later, the hotel itself produces Grady again. Cleaner, calmer, dressed as staff, speaking to the new caretaker as though continuing a conversation that never actually stopped. Watched that way, Grady is not a ghost haunting a location. He is a prior tenant of a role the building keeps refilling. The first known casualty of a pattern the architecture appears built to repeat. Which raises the question we are not yet ready to answer, but that the rest of this analysis is going to spend its remaining time circling. If the hallways do not close, and the window faces a wall, and the door is sealed with a number chosen for its meaning rather than its address, what exactly is all of that architecture holding in place? And why does it need a new caretaker every single time to keep holding? We're not done with that door yet, but dalsze, samое странное. Every threshold tradition on record agrees on one basic principle, even when the traditions themselves have nothing else in common. A boundary needs a marker. A door between one state and another does not stay a plain door. It gets a name, a symbol, a warning, something that tells whoever approaches it that they are not simply walking from one room into another. They are crossing. Room 237 has one of those markers, and it is hiding inside a mirror. Here is the scene, and if you know the film, you already feel your stomach tighten remembering it. Jack, alone in the caretaker's apartment, begins to unravel in front of his wife. He reports what he believes he has seen inside room 237, and as he talks, the film cuts to his wife discovering the truth for herself, alone, in that same room, standing at the bathroom mirror. Written on the door behind her, visible only in the mirror's reflection, is a single word, printed in what looks like lipstick or blood. R-E-D-R-U-M. Read forward, off the actual door, it is nonsense. Read backward, through the mirror, it resolves into a single word: murder. This needs to be said plainly, because the trick is almost too clean to be accidental. The film does not show you the word on the door directly, first. It withholds the door and gives you only the reflection, so that your own eye has to do the work of reversing it, which means the audience discovers the meaning at the exact moment the character does, through the exact same mechanism. That is not a jump scare. That is a piece of ritual staging, dressed up as a horror beat. Mirrors carry a specific, very old weight across an enormous range of folk traditions, and it is worth being precise about what that weight actually is, rather than reaching for vague spookiness. Picture a farmhouse parlor, somewhere in rural England, sometime in the 1800s, in the hour after a death has just been confirmed in the room upstairs.
before the neighbors arrive, before the body is even moved. Someone in the household, often the eldest woman present, by the custom folklorists have recorded again and again across regional surveys, goes from room to room with a length of black cloth and covers every mirror in the house. Not just the mirror nearest the deceased, everyone. The parlor glass, the hallway mirror by the door, the small shaving mirror in the good bedroom. She works quickly, without much explanation offered to the younger family members watching, because the reasoning is assumed rather than spoken. A soul newly loosed from a body is thought to be disoriented, still close, still capable of catching sight of itself in a reflective surface. And a mirror, in this belief, does not just show a soul what it has become. It can hold it there, snagged on its own reflection, unable to continue on the way it is supposed to go. The cloth is not decoration. It is a plug in a hole the household cannot otherwise close.
Variants of the same custom turn up independently in Appalachian mourning practice, documented by folklorists in the 20th century, and in older Central European accounts. Different regions, different centuries, converging on the identical instinct. A mirror, at the wrong moment, stops being furniture and starts being a door somebody forgot to lock. That is the custom the Overlook's bathroom mirror is quietly borrowing from. Other esoteric traditions treat mirrors and reflective water as liminal surfaces entirely, not solid barriers, but thin places where the boundary between one state and another grows permeable enough to let something look back through it. A mirror, in this reading, is never simply a reflective object. It is a second threshold, layered directly on top of the first one, doubling the door instead of just decorating it.
Now hold that against what the Overlook actually does with its mirrors, because the Gold Room takes this same idea and inflates it to the scale of an entire building. The Gold Room is the hotel's ballroom and bar, and it is drenched, deliberately, obsessively, in reflective gold surfaces. Mirrored walls, polished brass, glass behind the bar multiplying every figure in the room into rows of duplicates stretching back further than the actual architecture should allow. When Jack sits at that bar for the first time, alone, in a hotel the film has told us is completely empty for the winter, a bartender appears to serve him a drink. A bartender named Lloyd, who was never established as staff, who Jack has never met, and who the film never bothers to explain. The scene plays out as an ordinary conversation between two men at a bar. Nothing about the staging announces it as anything other than realistic, until you remember there is no one else in the building. There is an archival production still of that set, taken during construction at Elstree, that is worth sitting with for a moment before we go further. The kind of photograph you can find reprinted in books cataloging the film's design. In it, the Gold Room stands half-finished, house lights up instead of the warm bar lighting the finished scenes use, and what the photograph captures, almost by accident, is how much raw, reflective surface the room contains, even before a single actor has walked into it. Crew members caught at the edge of frame appear doubled, sometimes tripled, in brass fixtures still wrapped in protective paper. Look at that image long enough, stripped of the finished film's mood lighting and score, and the room stops reading as an elegant 1920s style lounge. It reads as a machine for multiplication, built and switched on before anyone had decided what it was going to multiply. Read through the same threshold lens as the bathroom mirror. The Gold Room stops looking like a nice room Kubrick decided to gild for atmosphere. It starts looking like a chamber purpose-built to multiply reflections until the line between the man sitting at the bar and whatever is sitting across from him gets genuinely difficult to locate. Some esoteric traditions, particularly strands of folk magic concerned with binding and containment, describe mirrored or highly reflective architecture as historically employed to disorient, to fracture a single presence into so many overlapping reflections that whatever enters a space like that struggles to find its way back out along the same line it came in on. We want to be careful here, because this is speculative territory, drawn from folklore and interpretive esoteric writing rather than any verified historical practice. But the pattern fit with what the Gold Room does on screen is hard to ignore once you've seen it named.
Put the two mirror scenes side by side, because together they complete each other rather than simply repeating the same idea. The bathroom mirror reverses a warning, and in doing so only reveals it. A small, single-object threshold, doing threshold work on a scale of inches, telling one specific character one specific truth she wasn't supposed to have yet. The Gold Room reflects an entire room across every gilded surface it owns, and in doing so, multiplies a threat into something that stops being locatable. A threshold blown up to the size of an entire hall, dissolving the line between one man and the hotel's history of men who sat exactly where he is sitting. Small mirror, singular revelation. Vast mirror, total disorientation. A locksmith uses two different tools depending on whether he wants to open a door quietly or seal it permanently. The Overlook, watched this way, has both tools built directly into its walls, and it uses them in the same building, on the same handful of characters, within the same handful of days. That is the answer, or as close to one as this analysis is going to get, for the question we opened several blocks ago. Why a door needs a number that reduces to closure, and a mirror that only tells the truth backward, and a room down the hall from it soaked in enough reflective gold to make a single man feel like a crowd. A hotel like this does not need ghosts wandering its halls to feel occupied. It only needs enough reflective surface and enough sealed thresholds to make sure whoever walks in starts seeing company almost immediately, whether or not anyone else is actually there. Every summoning tradition that bothers to write its rules down agrees on one unglamorous, deeply bureaucratic point. The ritual needs a vessel. Not a volunteer, not a hero, not necessarily even someone chosen for any quality of their own. Just someone standing in the right place at the right threshold when the container needs filling. That is the reframe we've been building towards since the very first minute of this analysis. And this is the block where it finally lands. Remember the second Elstree set we mentioned, the standalone stretch of corridor built apart from the rest of the hotel's continuity, used for exactly one purpose. That purpose is the shot that film scholars now treat as the single most analyzed image in the entire production. The elevator doors opening and a wall of blood pouring out of them in a volume no elevator shaft could plausibly hold, flooding the frame, swallowing furniture, rising until it drowns the camera's own point of view. Kubrick built that corridor separately, dressed it with a scale model and a specially engineered flood rig, and shot the sequence dozens of times over. Accounts from crew members put the number of takes required to get the blood's flow rate and color exactly right at somewhere close to 40, an extraordinary expenditure of time and film stock for a shot that runs only a matter of seconds on screen. This was not a corridor built to be walked through by characters. It was built to be filled, once completely on camera, and then struck. Picture the room where that fluid was actually made, days before anyone shot a single frame of it pouring. A production workshop at Elstree, tables covered in test batches, a makeup and effects team working through formula after formula, because water-thin theatrical blood, the kind most horror films of the era used without a second thought, simply refused to read correctly under studio lights. Too thin, too fast, too obviously fake once it hit that much volume. What the crew settled on, according to accounts from those involved in the production,
was a thick, syrup-based mixture, engineered specifically for how it needed to move. Heavy enough to crest and fold instead of splash. Slow enough that the camera could hold on it without the illusion collapsing. Tinted with a precision that had nothing to do with matching real blood, and everything to do with matching what red looks like once it has been filtered through celluloid.
Someone stood over a mixing vessel for days, testing viscosity by hand, chasing a formula exact enough to survive 40 takes of scrutiny from a director who would not accept anything less. That is not incidental craft. That is the same obsessive, almost liturgical precision the rest of this hotel was built with. A team spending days perfecting the exact texture of an overflow for a set that existed for no reason except to be filled. Sit with that distinction, because it is the whole argument in miniature. Every other set in this hotel was built for people to move through. Danny's tricycle, Jack's pacing, Wendy's search through the corridors. This one set was built for a single act of overflow. A chamber, constructed for the sole purpose of being flooded past its capacity, on command, in front of a camera crew who then dismantled it. That is also where the number on the door finally closes its own loop. If 237 functions as a seal, a threshold marked with a number esoteric numerology reduces to closure and containment, then the elevator sequence is what a seal like that looks like from the outside at the moment its contents exceed what it was built to hold. Grimoire traditions concerned with summoning and containment, most notably the 17th century compilation known as the Lesser Key of Solomon, spend a striking amount of their text not on the entities themselves, but on the mechanics around them. The marked circle the operator must not step outside of, the specific conditions under which an offering is accepted or refused, the consequence, spelled out in manuscript after manuscript, of a container that was undersized for what it was asked to hold. Read the elevator sequence through that lens, and it stops being a shock image bolted onto a haunted house movie. It becomes the schematic's failure state, rendered in seconds of screen time. The seal was holding, until, on camera, in front of us, it visibly was not. Now the vessel. Here is the reframe this entire block exists to deliver, and it deserves to be said as plainly as we can manage. The hotel does not choose Jack because Jack is uniquely evil, uniquely weak, or uniquely deserving of what happens to him. The hotel chooses Jack because Jack is available. He answers a newspaper advertisement for a seasonal position. He needs the income. He needs the isolation in his own mind as a chance to write, to recover, to prove something to himself and to his family, after a period the film only gestures at having gone badly. Nothing about his application marks him out as chosen. He is simply the next man who walked through the door and said yes to 5 months alone with his family in an empty building.
Consider what that means if you sit inside his interview scene the way it was actually written, rather than the way memory tends to flatten it after you already know how the story ends. A hotel manager, across a desk, laying out a job with excellent, ordinary corporate calm. Good pay, respectable responsibility, a chance to get real work done in the quiet months. He mentions, almost as an aside, that a previous caretaker suffered what he calls a kind of cabin fever, and ended his family's lives before his own. He says it the way a company discloses a liability, not a warning. And Jack, hopeful, a little desperate, visibly trying to sound like a man who has his life under control, laughs it off. Tells the interviewer isolation sounds appealing, not alarming. Neither man in that room treats the story as disqualifying. It reads, in the moment, like nothing more than an unfortunate footnote in an otherwise attractive job listing. That scene is not really about a job interview.
It is a transaction being completed in plain sight, and neither party at the table understands what they are actually agreeing to. Here is the injustice underneath it, and it is worth naming directly instead of leaving it implied. Jack does not fail some test of moral character that a stronger, better man would have passed. The film gives us no evidence anyone could have passed it. Grady, the caretaker before him, was by every account in the story an ordinary family man before that winter too. Not a monster recruited for his monstrousness, just another applicant who needed the position. The hotel's process does not appear to be selecting for cruelty. It appears to be selecting for proximity. Whoever is standing in the role when the isolation sets in is the one the architecture uses. That is a far colder mechanism than a villain origin story, because a villain origin story at least implies the outcome required something specific about the person it happened to. This implies it did not. It implies almost anyone, given the job, the isolation, and enough weeks with the walls, would have done. Think about how ordinary that listing would have looked, printed in a stack of newspaper classifieds alongside a dozen other seasonal postings that winter. A line or two about a historic mountain property, competitive pay, room and board included, light caretaking duties expected. Nothing in that wording singles out a man capable of what the story eventually asks of him. It reads like something a school teacher between contracts might answer, or a writer between advances, or a retired groundskeeper looking for one more quiet season before he stops working altogether. Any of them could have sat in that office chair. Any of them could have laughed off the same footnote about the previous man's cabin fever, because footnotes about other people's bad winters are easy to laugh off when you are the one who needs the job. The advertisement was not written for Jack. It was written for whoever answered it first. That is the thought worth sitting with longer than the blood, longer than the mirror, longer than the number on the door. A structure that does not care who fills its vacancy is a far more disquieting design than a structure with a grudge. A grudge, at least, can be reasoned with, appeased, understood. Availability cannot. Availability just waits for the next name on the application. But there is one member of that family the hotel's process never fully accounts for, and the film spends its entire second half circling why. Not Jack, not Wendy. The son, a boy the hotel's own staff seem to recognize, address directly, and treat with a caution they extend to no one else in the building, as though something about him sits outside whatever the architecture was built to process. We are going to spend the next stretch of this analysis on exactly that anomaly. Because if the hotel is a container built to select and fill an interchangeable vessel, the boy is the first piece of evidence in the entire film that the container has a flaw in its design. There is a scene early in the film that most people remember as background noise, a piece of throwaway exposition delivered while the camera is really focused on something else. The hotel's manager, walking Jack through a tour of the property, mentions almost in passing that the site was built on ground with a difficult history, land where, according to the story the film gives us, conflict with Native American communities had once taken place before the hotel was ever raised. He delivers the line the way a realtor delivers a disclosure nobody wants to dwell on. It passes in seconds. The tour moves on. We want to be careful with this thread, because it sits closer to real, documented history than anything else in this analysis, and it deserves to be treated as exactly what it is. A plot detail the film borrows from a broader, much-discussed convention in American horror fiction, not a verified claim about any specific property, real or fictional. The built on old contested ground premise recurs across decades of American horror storytelling, and critics and folklorists alike have written at length about what that convention tends to actually be doing under the surface. Using a real historical wound
as narrative shorthand for a place already saturated with grievance before the story's family ever arrives. Whatever discomfort that convention carries, and it carries real discomfort worth naming, the film uses it here as a single spoken line, then never returns to it directly again. But watch what the line accomplishes structurally, even delivered that quickly.
It reframes the entire hotel in one sentence, from a building that generates its own darkness to a building that inherited it, already standing on something with history attached before a single guest ever checked in. According to one interpretation that has circulated widely among people who study this film closely, the hotel does not create violence from nothing. It recycles it. It receives what the ground beneath it already carried, gathers it, and redistributes it forward through whichever family happens to be occupying the role that particular winter. Grady's family. Then, the film strongly implies, Jack's. Read that way, the burial ground line is not filler. It is the origin clause in the hotel's design brief, the reason the container needed building in the first place. This is also where Danny finally gets his answer. We left off last block on the anomaly the hotel staff cannot quite process. The boy, the ghostly figures addressed by name, warn directly, treat with a wariness they extend to no one else in the family. Watched through the lens this analysis has been building, block after block, the reason is almost mechanical in its simplicity. Danny has an ability the film calls the shining, a form of perception that lets him see the hotel's past and its intentions more clearly than any adult in the story, including his own father. A vessel, in the terms we used last block, needs to be filled without resistance. Danny is the one member of that family capable of recognizing the container for what it is while he is still standing inside it. That recognition is precisely what the architecture cannot use. It can flood an elevator shaft with an ordinary man's ordinary desperation. It cannot easily process a child who already sees the walls for what they are.
And so, by the film's final act, Danny does something none of the adults in this story manage. He leads his father into the hotel's outdoor hedge maze, a structure that mirrors, deliberately, the impossible corridor geometry we spent an earlier block cataloging indoors, just now built from hedgerow instead of hallway. And he escapes it, doubling back on his own footprints in the snow to throw off pursuit, using the maze's own logic of turns and dead ends against the man chasing him. He gets out. His father does not. Watch the mechanics of that escape closely, because they are the only moment in the entire film where a character actively outthinks the building instead of simply surviving it. Danny runs forward into the maze's corridors, snow packing under his boots, breath visible in the cold, his father's footsteps somewhere behind him, closer with every turn. Then he stops. He walks backward, carefully, stepping into his own prints one at a time, retracing the exact path he just carved through the snow, so that the trail reads, to anyone following it, as though it simply continues forward and vanishes. He steps off the trail at an angle, into an unmarked stretch of hedge corridor, and waits, motionless, while his father reaches the end of the false trail and stands there, turning in place, looking at footprints that appear to lead nowhere. It is the single cleverest human decision in the entire story, and it belongs to a child, because the child is the only one in that family still capable of thinking about the maze as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a hallway to be endured. He gets out. His father does not. That is the closest thing this film offers to a victory, and it is worth sitting with exactly how narrow that victory actually is. Danny does not defeat the hotel. He does not banish it, seal it, or expose it.
He simply proves capable of leaving a structure built to make leaving difficult. The one member of his family the container was never quite equipped to hold on to. Everyone else in that family does not get the same ending. Which brings us to the final image, the one Kubrick chooses to end the entire film on, and it is the coldest piece of evidence in this whole analysis. The camera, in the film's closing seconds, pushes slowly toward a black and white photograph hanging in the hotel's corridor, one among what appears to be dozens of framed photographs documenting decades of the hotel's social history, ballroom scenes, and formal gatherings stretching back across the building's lifetime. It pushes in until the photograph fills the entire frame, and the caption beneath it becomes legible. The Overlook Hotel, 4th of July Ball, dated the year 1921. Standing in the center of the crowd, dressed for the occasion, unmistakably, is Jack, the same man we have just watched freeze to death in the hedge maze outside, in a story the film has otherwise located decades after that photograph's date. Production accounts of how that final shot was actually built are worth knowing, because the craft behind it is almost as unsettling as the image itself. The photograph was not a simple prop dressed up to look old. According to accounts from the art department, the crew worked from a genuine period photograph, dated to match the decade the caption claims, and had Jack Nicholson photographed separately, in period costume, lit and posed to match the original image's crowd. The two exposures were then combined, frame by frame, until the seam between the real archival past and the constructed present became invisible to the eye. Somebody spent real working hours making absolutely certain that no viewer, however closely they paused the frame, would find the stitch line between 1921 and the man who was never supposed to have been alive to attend it. That is not incidental polish on a closing shot. That is the same obsessive concealment of a seam we found in the hallway geometry, in the window, in the door, a crew laboring to make sure the impossible thing reads as simply, quietly true. There is no dialogue over this shot, no explanation offered. The film simply holds on the image and ends. Treat that final photograph the way you would treat a filing record rather than a twist ending, because that is closer to what it is actually doing. It is not asking whether Jack was reincarnated or possessed or always secretly immortal. The film gives us no mechanism and offers none of the answers a tidier story would feel obligated to supply. What it gives us instead is a single, quiet piece of documentation. Proof the hotel has run this exact configuration before. A ball, a crowd, a man standing at the center of it who, according to every other date in this story, should not have been born yet. The photograph is not there to solve the mystery. It is there to tell you the mystery has already solved itself, repeatedly, on a schedule that has nothing to do with any single family's timeline. And that whatever the hotel is, it does not consider Jack's story to be an ending at all. It considers it an addition to an archive that was already this thick, decades before he ever answered that newspaper advertisement. The container was never empty to begin with. It was simply between occupants, filing its last vessel away, waiting on the next name to come through the door. Turn the camera around for a moment, because everything up to this point has been about a building. This part is about you. Not because we think you are in danger of checking into a haunted hotel. Almost none of you ever will be. But watch how quickly this pattern stops being about the Overlook once you strip away the mountains and the snow and the year Kubrick shot it. A structure that isolates whoever enters it. A structure that outlasts every individual person who occupies a role inside it. A structure that does not particularly need you specifically, only someone filling the position,
keeping the machinery running long enough for the next name to take over. You have almost certainly worked inside a version of that structure already, and you may not have thought of it in these terms before. Think about a closed chain of command, a company, an institution, any organization with a hierarchy old enough to have outlived several generations of the people who built it. New hires walk in, told a version of the founding story, usually softened, usually framed as history rather than warning.
Somewhere in that story is almost always a person who burned out badly, who broke under the pressure of the role, who left under circumstances the newer staff only hear about secondhand, in the tone people use for cautionary tales they don't actually expect you to heed. And almost universally, the newer hire, hopeful, capable, a little too confident in their own resilience, treats that story exactly the way Jack treated Grady's story in the manager's office, as an unfortunate footnote, not a warning meant for them personally. Picture this exact exchange happening in an ordinary conference room on someone's first morning, nowhere near a mountain or a hotel. A manager slides an onboarding folder across the table, walks through the benefits, the schedule, the reporting structure, and then, almost as an afterthought, mentions the person who held the role before. "We lost the last person in this seat kind of suddenly. Burned pretty hot, pretty fast, but honestly, that was a different set of circumstances. We've restructured a lot since then." And the new hire, already picturing the raise, the title, the fresh start this job represents after a rough stretch of their own, nods, smiles, says something like, "That makes sense. Thanks for the transparency," and never asks a single follow-up question about what "burned pretty hot" actually meant for the human being who sat in that chair before them. The folder gets signed. The tour continues. Nobody in that room is lying. Exactly. But nobody is really listening either, because the story on offer, quiet opportunity, meaningful responsibility, a fresh start, is simply too appealing to interrupt with questions about its last occupant. That scene repeats itself in office buildings on ordinary Monday mornings more often than most of us would like to admit, and it carries the exact emotional shape of Jack's interview, stripped of the snow. That is the pivot this entire analysis has been building toward, and it deserves to be said to you directly rather than left as subtext. A closed system does not need you to be weak or foolish or morally compromised in order to use you the way the Overlook uses its caretakers. It only needs you to be isolated enough and inside the structure long enough that the structure's demands start to feel like the only reasonable interpretation of reality available. Boardrooms run on this exact mechanism when the room itself becomes more permanent than any single person sitting in it, when decisions get justified not by whether they're right, but by whether they match "how we've always done things here," a phrase that survives every single person who originally said it, unchanged, passed down like a warning nobody bothered to read as a warning. Compounds, closed communities, high-control organizations of every kind run on it more explicitly still, controlling the flow of contact with anyone outside the walls, so that the group's internal logic becomes, gradually, the only logic left standing. None of these are haunted hotels. All of them share the Overlook's actual mechanism, stripped of the snow and the ghosts. Isolate the person, let the structure outlast them, and let whichever version of them survives the isolation define what normal meant all along. There is often a physical object standing at the center of institutions like this, and it is worth noticing how quietly it does its work. A brass plaque bolted to a lobby wall, engraved with a founding date decades back, established 1962 or some line like it, polished by whichever facilities contractor rotates through every quarter, walked past by every employee who has ever worked there,
on their way to a desk that has changed hands more times than the plaque has ever needed cleaning. Nobody stops to do the arithmetic on how many people have occupied any given role since that date was engraved. The plaque does not invite that question. It simply sits there, permanent, outlasting every single name that has ever reported to the office behind it, quietly performing the same function as that framed photograph in the Overlook's hallway. Proof the institution predates you and fully intends to outlast you, too.
Here is the part worth sitting with longest, because it is the part most people get wrong when they tell this story to themselves. You do not usually notice the isolation while it is happening. Jack does not experience his time at the Overlook as captivity. He experiences it as opportunity. Quiet, uninterrupted time to finally get real work done, away from the noise and failure of his life before the job began. That reframing is not incidental to how the trap works. It is the trap's actual mechanism. A structure built to hold you rarely announces itself as a cage while the door is closing. It announces itself as exactly the kind of quiet, focused, meaningful opportunity you had been hoping for. Let me be direct with you about why this matters more than a film analysis usually would. If a closed system in your own life, a job, an institution, a relationship, a chain of command you answer to, starts explaining away its own casualties as unfortunate footnotes, the way that hotel manager explained away Grady in one sentence and moved on with the tour, that is worth pausing on. Not panicking about, pausing on. The structure that produced one burned-out predecessor was not necessarily fixed by the time you walked through the door. It was just between occupants. Before we close this thread out, though, there is something worth admiring here, honestly, because it would be dishonest to spend this many blocks inside the Overlook's mechanics without acknowledging the sheer, disciplined craft it took to build a trap this convincing in the first place. Picture the Elstree sound stages during production, months before release. Long tables of blueprints spread across a construction office. Roy Walker's design team, cross-checking measurements against a hotel that, as we now know, was never actually meant to resolve into a coherent building. That is the detail worth sitting with. This was not sloppy work masquerading as intentional. Crew members who worked on the production have described a set build that ran for the better part of a year. Full-scale rooms constructed with real timber and real brass fixtures, rather than cheaper studio shortcuts. A director who reportedly required take after take of scenes other productions would have called finished after the second or third attempt. Building a hotel that quietly refuses to add up, convincingly enough that audiences have spent decades not noticing the scenes without help, takes more precision than building one that actually works. Anyone can draw a floor plan that closes. It takes real discipline to draw one that doesn't, and dress it so well that almost nobody catches the trick without being told exactly where to look. That discipline is worth admiring on its own terms, separate from anything the finished film is trying to do to your nervous system. A crew spent the better part of a year in service of an illusion this exact, this load-bearing, this quietly total. Whatever the Overlook is doing to the family inside its story, the people who built it were doing something genuinely impressive to construct the container in the first place. And it is worth remembering, every time we admire a piece of design this seamless, that the seamlessness is usually the most labor-intensive part of the entire thing. Which brings the pivot back around to you one more time, before we move toward where this analysis ends. The Overlook's genius was never really the haunting. It was the design discipline underneath the haunting, a structure built with enough care that its victims mistake the trap for an opportunity, right up until the moment the isolation finishes its work.
That same discipline exists in plenty of structures that have nothing to do with horror films. The question worth carrying out of this block is not whether you'll ever check into a hotel like this one. It's whether you'd recognize the design if you were already standing inside it. Let's step back and name what this analysis has actually been arguing, stripped of the hallways and the mirrors and the blood, because the systemic lesson underneath all of it is simpler than the imagery makes it feel. This was never a ghost story in the way ghost stories usually work. A wronged spirit, a specific grievance, a haunting that wants something from one particular family and will presumably rest once it gets it. What we have walked through, block by block, is closer to a design pattern.
A template for any closed system built to repeat itself through whoever happens to be occupying it at the time. Isolate the vessel. Let the architecture outlast the individual. Recycle whatever the ground already carried and hand it forward to the next name on the list. The Overlook simply happens to be the version of that pattern built out of timber and brass and impossible hallway geometry, dressed up convincingly enough by a director obsessive enough that it took decades of frame-by-frame scrutiny for audiences to see the mechanism clearly. Strip away the snow, and the pattern itself is not fictional at all. It is a description of how a great many closed systems actually function, whether or not anyone inside them ever calls it architecture. Historians who study company towns, the self-contained industrial settlements built by a single employer around a single mill or mine, common across parts of America and Britain through the industrial era, describe a version of this same pattern with almost no supernatural framing required at all. A worker arrives, often with a family, drawn by housing and wages a struggling economy elsewhere could not match. The town has one employer, one store, one landlord, and often one church, all controlled by the same company that controls the paycheck. Leaving means leaving the only economy the worker has access to. Grievances against one manager get absorbed and forgotten within a generation, folded into how things have always run here, while the mill itself, the actual structure, outlasts every family that has ever worked inside it. Labor historians studying these settlements have noted the same quiet mechanism this analysis keeps circling back to. A closed system does not need to threaten anyone directly. It only needs to become the entire visible world, long enough that the worker forgets a different arrangement was ever possible. The Overlook is that same design, translated into snowbound Gothic instead of factory smoke. The isolation does the work either way. That is the interpretation. Here is the darker version of it, the one worth carrying with you after this video ends. A pattern like this does not need malice to keep running. It only needs continuity, a structure old enough and closed enough that nobody left inside it remembers or was ever told what the room looked like before the current occupant walked in. Every one of the anomalies we cataloged across this analysis, the window facing a wall, the door sealed with a number chosen for its meaning rather than its address, the mirror that only tells the truth backward, the elevator built to overflow exactly once. All of it points at the same underlying design principle. A system built to repeat itself does not need you to notice you're inside a loop. It only needs you to mistake the loop, for as long as possible, for a fresh start. As always, think for yourselves, question everything. And if this kind of obsessive detail is the kind of descent you want to keep taking with us, take the half-second to like this video and subscribe so the next one finds you. Before we close, hold one last image with me, because it is the quietest piece of evidence in this entire investigation, and it belongs to no one but the film itself. Somewhere in an archive, a battered shooting script from this production still exists, pages soft at the corners, margins crowded with the director's handwritten notes on takes that never made the final cut. Turn to the page marked for the Colorado Lounge, the scene where light first pours through that impossible window, and the margin note beside it, according to accounts from those who cataloged the production's surviving paperwork, says almost nothing about ghosts or dread or the supernatural at all. It says something closer to a note about light levels, about where the sun should appear to be falling for the shot to read correctly on film. A working note, a craftsman's note. Nothing in it suggests the man writing it believed the window was anything other than a lighting problem to be solved before lunch. And that, more than any grand ritual theory this analysis has offered, might be the truest thing anyone can say about how a trap this convincing actually gets built. Nobody working on it necessarily needs to know what they are building. They only need to solve the problem in front of them, correctly, one scene at a time, and let the accumulated correctness of 100 small decisions add up to something none of them individually intended. Now, back to where we started. We opened this analysis standing inside the Colorado Lounge, looking at a window that should not exist. Sunlight pouring through glass that, according to the hotel's own floor plan, ought to be facing a solid interior wall instead of a mountain view. We asked at the very beginning why a building this obsessively constructed would allow a contradiction like that to survive, unfixed, in the finished film. By now, the answer should sit differently than it would have an hour ago. The window was never a mistake the crew failed to catch. It was the first visible seam in a container built to hold its contents through repetition rather than force. A hotel that does not need its geography to make sense to the people trapped inside it, because their sense of the place was never the structure's actual concern. Only ours, watching from outside, piecing the contradictions together decades later, was ever meant to see the whole shape at once. And that is, finally, the answer to the question this entire descent was built around. The Overlook's floor plan does not refuse to exist because Kubrick made an error. It refuses to exist because a floor plan that resolved cleanly would have let its occupants map an exit. A structure engineered to repeat itself through whoever is standing inside it cannot afford to be navigable. It can only afford to feel, for as long as the isolation lasts, like the quiet, meaningful opportunity you are hoping to find. The hallway never closes. The window never explains itself. The door stays sealed at 2:37, waiting on whichever name the advertisement produces next. And somewhere in an archive of photographs stretching back further than any single family's memory, there is already a frame reserved, dated, and waiting to be filled by whoever walks through that door believing, the way every occupant before them believed, that this time the quiet is simply quiet and nothing more. The Overlook is one building. The same pattern runs quietly through far more ordinary rooms, and that is the file we open next. Check the plaque on your own wall. Somebody was standing where you're standing.